just want to, my name is Jan van Zutphen. I'm the Urban Forest Manager with the City of Takoma Park. And on behalf of the City of Takoma Park and its trees, I'd like to welcome you to the Tree Canopy Assessment Seminar. If you want to take it out? Yeah. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule, your busy schedule this morning. I've worked for the City of Takoma Park for 2 years, and it's really great to work for a community that really values trees and urban forest. And I think a prime example of that was the purchase of Dorothy Woods, where many people contributed to make that possible. I want to acknowledge this morning some of the people present here. First of all, Mayor Stewart, thank you for being here. Also for the council members, Debala, Kosik, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and Mr. Kovar, thank you for being here and thank you for your service to the community. I also like to acknowledge the members of the Tree Commission that are present this morning, and also the members of the Committee of the Environment. So I wanted to ask you, what is the best time to plant a tree? Actually, many years ago, because then you would get the benefits of a tree, correct? The ecosystems, it would be grown. So what is the next best time to plant a tree? It's April the 6th. It's Arbor Day, when we celebrate Arbor Day in the City of Takoma Park. It will be from 10 to 2, and we'll be handing out seedlings, so please come on out and get your seedling. So we have information out on the table if you did not get that. One of the things that's out there as well is that the City Council is reviewing the tree ordinance. So there's information on that on the table, and also like to mention that there's a survey on the tree ordinance and how it's implemented, and we really like to get your feedback on that. So the survey is online. If you go to the city's website, you can type in tree ordinance review, and then that will take you to the page where you can take that survey. So the seminar will consist of 2 parts. The morning session, where Noah Ahles is here from the University of Vermont. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Ahles. Yeah. That was close.
Very close.
So they did a tree canopy assessment on the state of the tree canopy in the City of Takoma Park. They used data from Montgomery County, LiDAR data, and Noah's here to present their findings. There's a presentation and then also the report. I hope that you have a copy of both. So then this morning session is recorded and televised, so if you would be so kind to silence your cell phones, that would be much appreciated. Then after Noah's presentation, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A session. 2 people will be having 2 microphones, so just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then they can bring a microphone to you. That's from 10 to 12, approximately, depending on how long we need for the Q&A. The presentation, I think, is about half an hour. Is that correct? Yeah. The afternoon session will be focusing. It's a focused discussion on the tree canopy goal and implementation plan. It will be with members of the Council, Committee of the Environment, on the Environment, stand corrected, and the Tree Commission, and it's open to the public. It will not be recorded, but minutes will be taken, and those will be posted online. The presentation this morning will also be online on the city's website in the near future. For those of you that are arborists, licensed arborists, there's ISA CEUs available. At the end of the seminar, I'll put out a sheet that you can sign up for that. I hope that this seminar will be informative to all of you and helpful in maintaining and improving the city's urban forest. Without further ado, I will introduce Noah. He's a research specialist at the University of Vermont in the Spatial Analysis Laboratory. He graduated from the University of Vermont with a Bachelor's of Science degree and has since worked on high-resolution mapping projects, leveraging object-based image analysis in a data fusion approach. I'm sure you all got that. So he also specializes in crisis mapping in collaboration with the humanitarian open street map team. Without further ado, Noah.
Oh, thank you. I actually have my own mic. Thanks so much, Jan. So thanks everybody for coming today. Really appreciate being here. So our lab, the Spatial Analysis Lab, has been doing tree canopy assessments across the United States for many years in collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service, and really excited to show our results for the latest Takoma Park tree canopy assessment. So why do we care about trees? Tree canopy improves wildlife habitats and social cohesion between members in the community. It reduces stormwater runoff and also reduces the temperature during summer, like caused by the urban heat island effect. And it also improves air quality for the city. Oh, okay, this clicker's a little bit wonky. What is the tree canopy worth? So there are a lot of ecosystem services that have a substantial monetary value that tree canopy provides, and it's very difficult to get at these monetary values without tree canopy. It's the most efficient way to do it, including carbon storage, air pollution removal, avoided runoff, and there are many other ecosystem services that tree canopy provides. And this is calculated from an iTree project, so that's an industry standard Forest Service tool that can be used to calculate this. What % of Takoma Park is covered by tree canopy as of 2018 when we did this analysis? And we calculated 58% tree canopy for the city. So now I'm just going to go over some key terms that I'm going to go back to again and again throughout this presentation. So existing tree canopy, the amount of land covered by tree canopy that we have right now, and then possible tree canopy vegetation. Possible tree canopy vegetation is the amount of vegetative land not covered by tree canopy where it may be feasible to establish new tree canopy. So if you look out on your lawn, you might see grassy areas, maybe some bushy areas, where it would be relatively easy to plant a new tree. This does not include driveways or parking areas. It does not include any cement areas like that. We're just talking about grassy, shrubby areas where, again, the barrier of entry to planting a new tree is relatively small. And again, that's possible tree canopy vegetation. How was the tree canopy mapped? So what we're looking at here is a zoomed in area of Takoma Park. And this is high resolution imagery. So it's approximately a half meter to a meter in resolution. And what we're seeing here is a bunch of trees and then buildings, roadways, parking lots, stuff like that. So not only does this imagery have the bands of sight that we can see as human, the bands of color rather, but also it has something called near-infrared band within it. So that really helps us to detect healthy vegetation because chlorophyll reflects a lot of near-infrared light. So we're able to detect vegetation much more easily using this type of imagery. So we combine that high-resolution imagery with something called LiDAR. And LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It's an active sensor. So if you can imagine an airplane, it has a sensor on it, and it shoots a laser, which is just a ray of light down to the ground. It hits the ground, bounces back up, and it's able to calculate an XYZ point for that one bounce. And then you do that thousands and thousands of times across the landscape, and you have thousands and thousands of XYZ points. Then we interpolate between them. We patch them all together, and we create a 3D model of the ground. Again, it's very high resolution. So we can see individual buildings, for example, individual trees. And what we're looking at here, if I go back, you can see this is the same area covered. So the tree canopy has this rough texture, whereas buildings have more of a smooth texture. So we combine these two data sets, the high resolution imagery and then also the LiDAR, the 3D elevation model, which tells us height information. And we're essentially looking for, on a very, very basic level, okay, what is tall objects as seen in the LiDAR, and then what is also green as seen in the imagery. If it's tall and it's green, it's likely a tree. If it's tall and it's not green, it's likely a building or some other anthropogenic feature. And then not only did we map tree canopy for Takoma Park, but we also mapped 7-class land cover. And this includes tree canopy, grass shrub, bare soil, waterways, buildings, roads, railroads, and other paved surfaces. And it's really important to have these other classes of land cover so we can understand how tree canopy relates to the rest of what's going on in the city. Like, for example, how tree canopy relates to roads and parking lots and buildings. What is the tree canopy distribution by height? So here what we have, if we look at the legend on the lower right here, tree canopy displayed in height in feet. So the darkest blue here are the tallest trees, and then you get to lighter and lighter blue into light gray here, and that's a shorter and shorter tree canopy. And generally, tree canopy height can be used as a proxy for age. It can also be seen as the taller tree canopy has more robust ecosystem services and wildlife habitat. And here we're looking at, on the right, on the y-axis here, the number of trees. And then on the x-axis here, we have the height in feet again. And we can see that the majority of tree canopy is within this 40 to 90 feet in height range here. How is the tree canopy distributed by patch class? So what is patch class? Essentially, there are 3 different types of patches in size: large, medium, and small. And the darker brown here is large, and you can see it's larger clusters of tree canopy that are very, very close together, and there are very few gaps between them. So I think this is a really good example up here, where it's an entire block of tree canopy clustered together, and there's very few edges. It's mostly contiguous. And then we look at something that's medium, so it's smaller in size, and there's more edges, maybe more gaps. And then we get to small, which are generally single trees and trees, maybe a couple trees right next to each other. And patch class, forest patch class, can also be seen as the larger the patch is, the more robust the ecosystem service, the watershed service, and wildlife habitat as well. And if we look at the acreage here of the city of Takoma Park as determined by patch class, we see that medium has the vast majority of tree canopy within that class for the city of Takoma Park. How does tree canopy vary by land use? So there are 7 main types of land use within Takoma Park. So there's commercial, deciduous forest, high-density residential, industrial, institutional, medium-density residential, and open urban land. And the main takeaway, I think, from this map right here is the vast majority of the city is actually within this medium-density residential in brown here. And then some other really big classes that we're seeing are high-density residential and institutional in purple and pink. But the vast majority, much bigger than everything else combined, is the medium-density residential. So now that we look at that statistically, so on top here is a graph of existing tree canopy percentage. And then on the x-axis, it's by this land use class. On the bottom here, we have existing tree canopy in terms of area, and that's in acres. So a main takeaway here is medium density residential has the vast majority of existing tree canopy within the city. Even if you were to add up every other land use type here, it wouldn't even get close to medium density residential. And it's great to see that medium density residential has above 60% of the land use is tree canopy. That's really great. We can definitely, it's understandable that deciduous forest has the highest percent of tree canopy at well over 80% there. And then high-density residential is a pretty decent area as well in terms of existing tree canopy. So now we're looking at that possible tree canopy vegetation. So that, again, just as a quick reminder, that's areas that could potentially have tree canopy planted without too many barriers because it's grassy or shrubby areas that you wouldn't have to remove concrete or anything. And so, again, the medium density residential area has the most in terms of area for the city. And again, this is a percentage on the top and then area on the bottom here. So medium density residential has 15% of that land use type as possible area where new tree canopy could relatively feasibly be planted without too much barrier of entry. And then what's interesting here as well is if we look at industrial, you'll see the highest possible vegetated tree canopy percentage in industrial, but because it's such a small area in terms of acres, we're not even looking at 5 acres of land here. Even if there was an aggressive tree canopy planting campaign for this percentage, the relative magnitude for the city, it would be very small, just because the overall area here is very small. How does tree canopy vary by ownership? So there are 7 ownership types as well in the city. We have Board of Education, Board of Trustees, MGCCC, City of Takoma Park, Maryland National Capital Park, Montgomery County, private/other, and ROW, which is rights of way. And rights of way are these black areas generally associated with roads and streets. So what's the big takeaway from this map here? The vast majority of the area of the city is within private/other. So if we look at the statistical breakdown of this ownership type, again, we have existing tree canopy percentage on the top here, existing tree canopy area in acres on the bottom, and then ownership type on the x-axis. So the private area is by far the largest. Again, if you were to add up all the other types besides private would be the biggest by far. And you wouldn't be very surprised to know that private it has a large correlation with the land use type of residential, both medium density and high density residential. So another interesting thing here is MNC PPC has a very high percentage of tree canopy, existing tree canopy, well over 80%. That's likely due to that ownership type being correlated with the land use deciduous forest. So again, that's a very similar attribution. And then something to note here is the rights of way actually have a lot of existing tree canopy as well. And so when I say rights of way, what I'm really talking about are street trees. So really we can just think of this as our street tree amount here. And that's actually the second biggest by ownership type after private. There we go. Okay, now we're looking at the possible vegetated tree canopy percentage here and the possible vegetation tree canopy area in acres. So again, where we could feasibly plant tree canopy relatively easily. The largest by far, again, privately owned land. And then the next biggest here is the rights of way, these street trees. So our leverage points really are within these privately owned lands and then the land immediately adjacent to these privately owned lands in the street trees. Something that's interesting here as well is if we look at education, we see the highest percentage of possible vegetated tree canopy for the city. But this might actually be a little bit misleading because areas that are within this ownership type in education have a lot of recreational areas and recreational fields. So while we see this really high area, that includes like soccer fields, baseball fields, stuff like that, you know, so it generally wouldn't be socially desirable to put a tree right in the middle of those. How does tree canopy vary by ward? So we're looking at existing tree canopy by ward here. So I think one of the first things to jump out here is in Ward 6, there's 44% tree canopy. That actually makes sense because there's a lot of commercial and industrial areas within that part of the city. And then Ward 2 has the largest amount of existing tree canopy at 68%. And that also makes sense because that contains most of the deciduous forested areas within the city. Something interesting to note here is that Ward 3 and Ward 1 are mostly residential areas, and they're, again, showing robust tree canopy at roughly 60% of existing. So now we're looking at the possible vegetated tree canopy by ward, again, where we can plant trees relatively easily. So something interesting here is Ward 4 has 19% tree canopy, possible vegetated tree canopy. However, that has a large percentage of the educational ownership type, where these recreational fields are located. So that, again, might be a little bit misleading, the 19% there. It's probably closer to actually where feasibly trees could be planted, are closer to the citywide average of 15% for the city. And then what's interesting here is, again, largely residential areas within Wards 1 and 3 here. And so that shows another leverage point of there's a lot of residential areas that can, a tree planting can be occurring potentially on Arbor Day. How has Takoma Park's tree canopy changed? So this is actually the third tree canopy assessment that our lab has done for the city of Takoma Park. In 2009, we calculated 59% tree canopy for the city. 2014, 62%. And 2018, 58%. So generally, the takeaway here is we're seeing relatively stable at 60% for the citywide. Oh, and I should note, this is based on land area and excludes water, but that actually doesn't change the calculation very much. There's not too many waterways within the city. So now I'm just going to go through the process of what we're actually looking for in tree canopy change detection, because we're looking at how tree canopy changed from 2014 to 2018. This is just a base map of a zoomed in area of Takoma Park. Now I'm going to show you LiDAR from 2014. So what I want you to focus on here is this area right here. But first I'm going to go through what types of classes we use to determine change detection. First we have no change here, which is this purple tree canopy. And that's tree canopy that existed in the 2014 analysis and still exists in the 2018 analysis. And then we also have loss here, which is an orange. And that's tree canopy that existed in the 2014 analysis, but does no longer exist in the 2018 analysis. And then we have gain, tree canopy that did not exist in the 2014 analysis, but now does exist in the 2018 analysis. So if we look in this yellow circle here, we see within this orange color, a texture, a highly textured tree canopy. That's actually representing the tree canopy when we see that texture. And so if I go to this next slide, which shows, again, this slide we're looking at is LiDAR 2014. The next slide will be LiDAR 2018. Now we see that these areas are all smoothed out. And what that means is that now the elevation model is showing the ground or buildings underneath where the tree canopy existed. So that's showing that tree canopy was actually removed from 2014 to 2018. So I'm going to go back here to look at that again. It was textured there within the orange, and now it's smoothed out. Do that one more time. So that's one of the ways that we used to detect that there was tree canopy removed between that 4-year period. So now I'm going to go through another example. Another base map here. This is Philadelphia Avenue. Oh, sorry. The clicker gets a little ahead of itself sometimes. So if we look in this yellow circle here, we see this green as representing gain. So you can actually see a little bit of vegetation underneath this green already in the 2014 LiDAR, but it actually doesn't reach what our threshold of height that we use to calculate tree canopy at roughly 8 feet. So when we move on to 2018 here, you'll see that that tree canopy has grown, and that means that it has indeed reached above that 8-foot threshold, and now we're classifying that as gain because it was too short to be classified as tree canopy in 2014, but now in 2018 it is classified as tree canopy. Oh, okay. How is the change distributed by land use and ownership? So I'm going to take a second to look through this and get you situated real quickly because it is a little bit busy. We're looking at tree canopy change from 2014 to 2018 in terms of acres. So we're looking at negative acreage, loss of tree canopy. That's what that's representing. And then on the x-axis here, we're showing the ownership type, where that tree canopy was lost. And then within each bar, we're colorizing based on what land use type that tree canopy was lost in. So the main takeaway from this is that most of the tree canopy lost citywide was in the private ownership type. And within that private ownership type, the vast majority was in yellow at medium density residential. The next biggest within the private ownership type of loss was in high density residential. So what does that tell us? The most of the tree canopies that were being taken down within that 4-year time span were within the residential areas within the city. The next biggest loss category here was in the rights of way or the street trees category. And then within that, again, medium density residential and high density residential. And what that really, what that means here, that residential areas are within the rights of way, that means that it's just they're adjacent to them, and the street trees are essentially right next to people's houses that we're losing here. How is the change distributed throughout the city? Let's see. There we go. So this is showing absolute change percentage of tree canopy throughout the city. So in yellows and oranges, we're seeing relative stability of tree canopy. And then we get into the reds and darker reds, and that's showing loss of tree canopy. So what's interesting right here is it almost seems like there's a banding effect that we can see across the city. Most of this area is within residential areas. It's also the closest to the city boundary of DC. Through this analysis, we're not able to figure out why this banding effect is happening, but it raises some really interesting questions. For example, one potential reason for this is, could this area have been the first planted in this city, and these trees are reaching old age and needing to be removed because of that? Is it possible that there's some type of pest, something like that? Not sure. This type of analysis does not cover in those directions, but it's just something interesting to note. And those areas are also within the residential areas of the city, the majority of them. So what are some of the conclusions that we can draw from this analysis? Takoma Park has a robust urban forest. The percent tree canopy is relatively high for an urban area and on par with similar communities, for example, Greenbelt at 63% tree canopy. Preserving the current tree canopy is really important. It is less expensive and more efficient to retain the existing tree canopy. This does not mean to dissuade from planting new trees, but it takes a long time for tree canopies to grow and start contributing to ecosystem services and wildlife services. And it's really quick to cut down a tree. So preserving is really, really important as well as planting new trees. And then residents are the key. Residents control most of the existing tree canopy and have the most room to plant new trees. And on top of that, the street trees that have a high percentage of possibility to plant new trees in grassy areas, as well as their adjacency to residents and private-owned land, it shows a really great leverage point. Potentially education of maintenance of street trees could be another important factor in developing the tree canopy for the future in Takoma Park. And lastly, I'd just like to say, this type of analysis is important for doing inventory, for understanding overarching metrics and goals for the tree canopy here within the city. It does not replace field work to go on the ground and figure out why are these trees either growing fine or being lost. In general, the city has a very robust urban tree canopy. There are some causes for concern and some more questions to be answered. Why are we seeing some loss across the city as well? And that's all I have for you, so thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Noah. I really appreciate your effort, and all the people from the University of Vermont that worked on this, the presentation as well as the assessment. So thank you. I wanted to open it up for question and answers, hopefully. And then Tina, if you would cover this area over here. So somebody will bring a microphone to you. And then Nancy. Is Nancy here? Okay. Okay, yeah.
We blew these up. They were in the presentation just because I thought it'd be so you could see citywide what they were showing us little snippets of.
So this kind of shows the large canopy trees in this area. This is the Sligo Creek area, and then this is the area where there's loss, and that's kind of you can see that over here.
That's the height.
Right. Yeah, and it's exactly. Yeah.
This was the height chart. This was the canopy existing and lost, and that was the heat map.
And that's from 2014 and 2018. So.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. It's data rich and really presented in a very clear way. So you have really great subcategories, classification categories. I was just curious if when you have the commercial or high density residential building, I didn't see any notations about the rooftops. Are you including planting area that could be a green roof, or it could be occupied by solar panels or something else? How does the area on the rooftop of a big building fit into which category?
Great question. So we are not including building rooftops, even if they are green roofs. We're not including that in the possible tree canopy vegetation category. Yeah, and did you mean in terms of solar panels? Do you mean solar panels on the ground or on rooftops as well?
Well, I guess that was sort of an afterthought. What we saw was a hard area. You know, if we were looking at a green infrastructure area, would it be a stormwater would it help us with stormwater, or would it help us with renewable energy? You know, I mean, we have, if you're going to do a rooftop, it has to do one or the other. It's probably not going to do both.
I see what you're
Yeah.
saying. Yes.
So is there any analysis of the solar impact in terms of where solar can be? Because it seems to me that that's one of the stressors for the tree loss, that there's been so much growth in solar panels in the Takoma Park area. And the two are kind of at odds with each other in terms of this. Has there been any, or is it possible to do analysis from the LiDAR study of what is the solar shading and where would be good places to do, solar installations to try to ameliorate this, this loss?
I think the majority of tree canopy loss, from my experience in the past 2 years in the city of Takoma Park, is related to the age of the canopy and trees aging and reaching the end of their lifespan. There hasn't really, as far as I know, that much loss of tree canopy because of installation of solar panels. And so because the city has the permitting process that would have to go through a permitting process, and the tree commission has taken a position on that as well, and typically it's not so likely to be approved, the removal of trees, that is, for solar panels. And the reason for that is that trees provide a lot of benefits, ecosystem benefits, and it's the opinion that they outweigh the benefits of solar panels, because there's also benefits to solar panels, of course, but that particularly the large canopy trees provide more benefits than, depending a bit on the location, of course, than the solar panels.
But is there any effort to try to maximize both?
So,
Can you use the data from this?
If I could step in for a second.
Sure.
You can definitely use this data, both the LiDAR, so the elevation, and the tree canopy modeling that we've done, as a further step to then look at solar panel potential and potentially even look at how you could use solar panels most efficiently and make sure to keep tree canopies safe if that is main concern. That's not something that we've already done, but it is possible to do that using the data that we've used as a starting point.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's fascinating. I was curious about this last slide where you say that we have a robust urban forest. I guess I wanted to hear you elaborate a little bit on that. What constitutes a robust urban forest? Like, what's the percentage that we should be shooting for? Like, what's the gold standard for an urban forest, given similarities to other places?
Can you also add how long an urban forest lasts? What's the age?
And before you answer that, let me just say, since this is recorded, if you speak without the mic, it's just a big blank spot on the recording. So I know it's very difficult, but if you could, raise your hand, we'll get the mic to you as quick as we can.
Do you want me to start on that one?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Actually, could you say, sorry, one more time?
How do you define a robust urban forest?
Thank you. So
Piece
how do
that
you
together
define, relatively to other communities, this community is, around 60% is higher than a lot of other communities that we have previously mapped. I can't specifically say what a gold standard is, but I would say that all of the work that has previously gone into planting and retaining tree canopy here within Takoma Park is laudable, besides that, I think it's how well can you continue to keep that momentum? Because I think something that is really maybe something that we'd like to hone in on is how do we preserve what we already have in the face of changing temperatures and pest in the face of pests. I think that's the real crux of it for me.
I think also, if I may jump in, so what is a robust urban forest? I think you look at the health, you look at the existing vegetation, you look at the overall number. Trees typically have a certain lifespan. the other factors are, what kind of ordinance does a place have in place? I think doing an assessment, tree inventories, and an assessment really are helpful to kind of see, okay, what's here. So those are some of the things. I don't know if there's a gold standard. I think compared to a lot of other communities, the city of Takoma Park has a really high number. But I think we'll discuss, more this afternoon also. So what are some of the threats that are facing the urban forest? What are some of the opportunities, et cetera, to kind of see. I think a real key part is going to be an implementation plan based on the discussion today and just on other things that we can see what is a good implementation plan and how do we move forward.
Hey, Noah, could you go back to the slide that had the 2009 to 2018 chart?
The
That one there, yes.
Oh, whoops. There we go.
My first question is, when did you begin using LiDAR? Was it 2014 or was it earlier?
2009 also included LiDAR within the tree canopy assessment.
Okay, I was concerned that the increase from 59 to 62 is because of better data, but you're saying 2009 actually was LiDAR. Would you say that the quality of data between 2009 and 14 was as good as the quality of data between 2014 and 18?
It's a really good question. So there are some differences in the LiDAR. 2014, potentially, it was taken at slightly different time of year, meaning that the leaf out of the tree canopy was more prevalent than the other 2 years, both 2009 and 2018. So yeah, what you're getting at, it's possible that within the methodology of using the LiDAR, that 2014 may have been potentially a better data set to represent the actual tree canopy that's there. And so that's a little bit difficult to quantify. There's no like gold standard of truthing this. This is, I think, looking at the tree canopy across all three tree canopy assessments, seeing as relatively stable as 60%, I think is a good way to look at it.
So you wouldn't say that we're losing 1% a year over 4 years?
I think that is likely not the case. It's difficult for me to say, but there are differences in the data sets that were available to us to do this analysis, and I think that has to be taken into account when looking at this data.
The other thing to consider is that it's a lot easier to map loss of tree canopy than it is to gain, because if a large canopy tree is removed, it's it's instantaneously, whereas growth of trees is very slow and gradual. So I think that's another factor to take into consideration, that trees that are planted now, you're not going to see the benefits of those trees 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So it's a much more gradual process.
I think it takes about 10 years for a newly planted tree to become a blip on the LiDAR imagery. When would Takoma Park be able to do the next LiDAR assessment so that we can see the trajectory that we're on?
It's typically recommended to do it every 5 to 10 years. So hopefully we can do that in another 5 years. And it's good that we have the 2014 and the 2009 data. We're using Montgomery County LiDAR data. So it is very helpful, and we appreciate that we can use those data. So hopefully in another 5 years or so, they can do another flyover and have additional data.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. I guess because I have the mic, I guess I'm next. You had a slide where you circled in yellow a certain area, and to show tree loss. That was, yeah. Where is that, and what did you conclude from? Could you conclude anything from that particular loss?
You mean the specific one here in yellow?
Yeah, is that a worrisome kind of thing, or anything that we could draw conclusions from?
Well, I think looking at just this one example here in yellow wouldn't lend itself to drawing conclusions. But looking at the citywide pattern of loss is something that you could draw conclusions from. In that there's definitely more loss than gain at this current time. That's what we were able to really tell as the story of these analyses. But yeah, just looking at one example like this, the printouts are going to be a great way to help look at the entire city. I think just focusing on one example, what I would actually be interested in is somebody on the ground figuring out within here, okay, what happened to this tree? But from an overhead perspective, we can't really draw any conclusions from something on this micro scale.
Great presentation, thank you. I will be interested to know if you can use that methodology to see what is the composition of the trees in Takoma Park. If you can use the LiDAR methodology to try to identify what is the species compositions, maybe that will help clarify that problem here when you have a lot of losses of the tree. Because some species of the tree that are canopy live less longer than another. So is it able to do that, or are you planning to do that?
I have actually worked before on projects where we are identifying tree canopy on the species level, and what's required of that is something called a hyperspectral camera. So that's, we can see within a very thin range of wavelengths as humans, and you need a camera that can expand that to many dozens of times the range of wavelength that we can see to identify tiny changes in the light signature, the reflection of light within these ranges. Long story short, we don't have that data available for this area, and even with that data, that's kind of on the cutting edge of remote sensing science. Only very few labs are able to do that well and with a lot of confidence. I think the much more attainable solution to this would be using this data set in conjunction with a field crew with iPads or smartphones and verifying, okay, what is this tree's species, where is it, putting a point down on it, and then doing that hundreds of times across the city, if not thousands, and then analyzing the data further. That would be a much more attainable process.
Are you planning to do that?
Not at this time.
I think that's a question for Jan.
The other thing, if you look at this map over here, the maximum canopy height for individual trees, so that kind of gives you a good indication where the large canopy trees are, the medium and the smaller size canopy trees, and you can kind of see, as I mentioned, this is the Sligo Creek area, and you can see there's a lot of large canopy. You also see in this section of the city there's a good portion of large canopy trees. So height and large canopy trees are smaller, medium size, they're closely correlated.
Great. Jan, I think this is probably a question for you. I want to go back to the issue of loss and that band that was identified. Given the permitting requirements we have, is it possible to see, going back to right-of-way, how much of this may be attributable to PEPCO utility work versus, people requesting to take down trees in their homes for additions and things like that? Because I think that could inform our conversation later today.
Sure, yeah. So based on my experience in the past 2 years, I would say that the majority of tree loss is really due to private property owners removing trees that have reached the end of their lifespan. I think there's relatively, since Takoma Park is an older community, very built up, there's relatively people at additions, there's relatively few new buildings that go up. So I think the loss due to construction is relatively small. But I think the majority of the tree loss is really removal of trees on private property and then large canopy trees. And then in addition to that, there's a number of larger canopy trees that are in the city right-of-way that need to be removed because of safety reasons. So I think that's kind of where the main loss is taking place.
Here's the microphone. So given that and looking at that band, is there, or is this a question for this afternoon, a program being put into place or being thought of to actually approach what to do about this? Because my understanding, no one answered this, but an urban forest sort of starts to decline after 50 years. We're a lot older than that. And so these trees are declining. And how do you go about replacing them in a proactive way where the burden isn't on the homeowner? I mean, right now, things are being replaced because they fall. And but that's significant damage and dangerous
Yeah, sure.
to
And
wait.
you know, that's one of the reasons, and the articles are on the table as well. I think tree maintenance is really an important part, plays an important part. The tree safety article that was in the March newsletter is also printed out, and please grab a copy if you don't have one. You know, trees need maintenance, just like any other part of a property, of a house. The other thing, I think that's one of the reasons why these assessments are so valuable, that you can kind of start to see where the loss is. And then, you know, with a canopy goal, and particularly with an implementation plan, you can start to kind of see, okay, if there's a lot of loss of trees on private property, how can we promote tree planting on private property? Montgomery County has a tree planting program in place, Tree Montgomery. We do the bulk buy program that promotes tree planting on private property. But wherever the loss is, that's where replanting needs to be done. But that's, I think, for an implementation plan, that's really where we'll be looking as to how we can address the point that you're making.
So one more general point. Big data fascinates me. So I'm wondering if this data is eventually going to let us get a handle on climate change. Specifically, my own anecdotal observations is that climate change is having the biggest effect on large canopy trees. Those seem to be those are the trees that have come down in my yard, in my neighbors' yards, and other things that I've seen. And I also see that most residents do not want to replant large canopy trees. They want to plant a smaller tree. So there's a sociological thing going on. But I'm wondering if sometime in the future we'll be able to map the big storms, like the one from yesterday. I have a large limb in my backyard.
Yeah.
Map the big storms to the loss of canopy, so we would know, you know, if that is a significant loss or if that's just an anecdotal observation.
Do you have any thing that you want to comment on that?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is we're looking at these assessments every 4 to 5 years. So you would have to have intermediate data in between those years to make sure that we can. So for example, what I mean by that is, again, you see a large tree fall on X date, and you essentially have a field collection app on your phone, and you put it in, this tree with this lat long coordinate was lost due to this storm, and there's a lot of data that comes with a storm as well, and you could then correlate all that to our next tree canopy assessment or the previous one, because you're looking at the height and general statistics of each tree. So you actually wouldn't have to wait for the next tree canopy assessment to be able to correlate all that data together. I think that's a very interesting and project and a good opportunity.
I think also in the past 15 to 20, 25 years, I think from my observation, the weather events in general have been more severe, whether it's drought in any direction, storms. So I think it's important to look at that and how that has changed the urban tree canopy. I think, you know, to go back to what I just mentioned previously, is that maintenance is really important in that tree maintenance. I think tree failure and limb failure can be avoided, you know, 80 to 90%, not in all situations, with proper maintenance. And it's also, you know, for the tree health best. But I think, you know, the derecho in 2012, I think had a significant impact, particularly in certain communities. When I just came on board, there was the ice storm, which did a lot of damage to trees. So it's definitely a factor. Particularly, there seemed to be microbursts in certain areas where it really takes down. On Jackson Avenue, there were quite a few trees that were impacted. So I think particularly on a small scale level, in certain areas, it can really have a significant impact. So it's a good point. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. Just in looking at the three maps charts up at the front, and I know it's hard to generalize entirely from that, but if the height is also a measure of how old they are, and then if you look at the heat map, it does seem as if in the areas where they're tall and older, but not along rivers and dense forests, but just sprinkled in among residential areas, maybe kind of where I live, that seems to be where a lot more of the loss is happening, whereas the taller, older ones, don't seem to be dying off as much in the areas that are kind of more protected. So I don't know if that relates to, if that's even true, but if that could relate to either maintenance needing to be done better, or they're just not protected when winds come through as they are in, along Sligo Creek or whatever, or whether that's a climate change factor too. But is that even an accurate trend that I'm sort of half seeing?
Well, I think it's a very interesting trend, and thank you for raising that. It's I think one of the things is that when trees are together, they can withstand storms a lot better. So I think when you have the larger forested areas like around Sligo Creek, those trees fare in general better during storms. Whereas I think in this area, they're more individual trees, so I think they might be more susceptible. I think that's one reason, and I think, the point that Noah raised about when the city was built, if some of the trees in this area may be older. I don't know enough about the history of Takoma Park if that may play a role, but it's I think certainly good to look at. Are there also certain pests or diseases that trees are more susceptible to in this area? Those are all things to look into and to see if there's, and then also to be proactive to see if we can raise awareness and have more trees planted.
And Noah, can you switch back to that slide of the small, medium, and large groupings? Because we'll see how that overlays with this area of loss, and if that's in a medium category, it might lend some more. Oh, you don't have the whole.
This
Yeah,
one?
we'll have to. We've got that whole piece.
Yeah.
That might be another good one to blow up and have available, so we can analyze that on a citywide, and see if that indeed where the loss was a more medium forested area, which would mean more space between the trees. I think it also goes without saying that trees around people's houses are much more heavily impacted than trees in a wooded area. It's just humans. We drive, we walk, we play, it's harder for a tree to survive in a residential area than it is in a wooded parkland.
That was a really great presentation, thank you. I just want to make an observation. I'm not a tree professional, but I do garden work and garden design, and a lot of times I'm working in situations where I would say the trees were not planted intentionally many years ago, and that really speaks, I think, a lot to people generally want to take care of the trees, but sometimes the trees are in positions that are just really not tenable long term. So the homeowners feel a little bit stuck in a sense that they want to do the right thing, but the thought of finding another place on their land to plant another oak when they've already got 3 that are kind of marginal seems really difficult. So I just wanted to bring that up as Takoma Park for a long time was a very modest community, and people didn't have a lot of money. Well, not a lot of intentional tree planting went on that I can see in my experience. So that's just an observation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, and then I'll get you next.
I'm sorry, I forgot my question.
You can come back to it. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate the city having done this and your work. And first I wanted to say that, Jan, I really appreciate your emphasizing tree maintenance, because it's like aging well. If you smoke and drink heavily, you're not going to live as long, and your natural lifespan is going to be a lot shorter. And it took me many, many years of living in Takoma Park before I realized we should be mulching our trees instead of raking away all of our leaves out to the street and leaving nice, clean grass all around everything. It took me many years to realize that. And I see, a lot of people haven't quite caught on to that yet. But the other thing is I just wanted to share, in response to something the mayor raised about WSSC work, that we have had, since WSSC dug up the end of our driveway, a little tiny bit of our yard, and the whole street in front of us, and then they compacted it. They filled things in with stone and compacted it really tight. This is what Ian Chamberlain has suggested to me is the cause of this groundwater under our house now that's been seeping out since like September, since they finished their work. right at the line where they filled it in with the rock. So I spoke about this with another resident who said, wow, WSSC is doing this all over, our North Takoma neighborhood. And so, and what the arborist, who was there with Jan, suggested is that's a problem for the flooding of the tree roots. Even where it isn't a problem of having cut the roots, the water pools around the tree roots and can't get out, can't continue flowing because the street rock has been packed so tight. And so the tree roots can actually drown. And so this is another thing that I hope the city council and mayor will discuss with WSSC about, is there some way of changing this, even compacting it less tightly so that we don't end up unintentionally another insult to the life of trees. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a suggestion. Could you go back to your slide that shows the red loss, or forward to your slide?
Across the entire city?
Yeah, the LiDAR 24. Yeah, that one there.
Okay.
To this gentleman's point about big data, I think it'd be fascinating to take the point data from tree permits issued for removals and overlay those on the GIS here, so we can see what trees are coming down with a waiver where there's not a planting requirement because of the old age or death of the tree, and what trees are being replanted when required, to see what that information looks like on an annual basis. I haven't looked, I don't know if you publish that data on an annual basis, but that should be part of an annual report card, is how many trees are coming down by permits, and how many replacements are being required, and then also how many trees per year are being planted through the giveaway, the subsidized planting program, and where those are going in, and then overlay that with your ward Canopy amounts. Maybe I can't be here for the afternoon session, but curious to see where we go with the thoughts about changing the regs. I think there's concern maybe that the regs aren't working well to even hold ground. But yet I feel like there's got to be a better effort to make sure that people are for something rather than against something. I think there's a lot of room here, before we go about messing with the tree regs, there's a lot of room here to promote the canopy through a goal process and an annual planting effort. And do you want me to give the mic back to you? No, I was just going to respond to your question. Oh, okay. That we should maybe, there's a lot of room here to push in the positive direction rather than to back up because of the resentment of a tough law, when we see the trajectory could very well be negative on an annual basis. So I think there's a lot of room here to hold our ground and to take a positive approach to make sure that homeowners aren't pissed off about the tree regulation, but are encouraged to join the effort to either hold ground with no net loss, or to get us to a new canopy goal across the city, whatever that may be, so that we can enjoy gains in our commercial areas, our heat islands. I didn't see that's a heat map, but it's not the heat temperature map.
Right.
It'd be great to overlay temperature with removals, and in terms of prioritizing things going forward, where do we need trees the most for heat island? Solar's a different issue. But there are some commercial areas, schools, other zones in these wards where we need more trees, and it's probably the hardest places to plant, because it requires removing asphalt or digging locations or what have you. But there's a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of pushing the needle in the positive direction before the council even considers rolling back something or changing the rules. I think us collectively here can do a better job to support Jan's efforts and the city's efforts to make sure that business is done in a customer service friendly way, but that resources are made available to get trees planted for those who've lost trees, or maybe can't afford the new trees being planted. I have lots of thoughts on this, but I'll end there.
One quick clarification. This map over here is actually the area of concentrated tree canopy loss for the 2014-2018 time period. So it's not heat related, just an FYI, if that was maybe.
Can I offer just some perspective on this
Absolutely.
basket of goods? My name is Tina Murray, and I'm chair of the Tree Commission. And I think what is driving this whole tree initiative from the council's perspective is exactly the issues that you are raising. We're really kind of digging in deep into the ordinance now in a concurrent process with this evaluation and setting the tree canopy goals, but the whole idea is to move the city into a more dynamic process. Right now, the current ordinance is really oriented around maintaining what is here. I think it's kind of arguable that it succeeded in that goal, but we're not really perceiving that that's really enough moving forward. And some of these data sets is kind of pointing us in a direction that that thinking is probably correct. So it's all three legs of the initiative moving in the same direction at the same time, that we hope that at the end, the ordinance update will be one piece of a larger perspective, that we're actually moving the canopy forward rather than just leaving it where it is. I don't think there's a real sensibility that that's enough.
I'd like to reinforce both of those in that I think that this is a great analysis, but it's one layer. And I think there is a really important missing layer, which is what is happening in terms of the replacement. Overlaying that here, I think would help us to know whether or not our method is actually maintaining as this layer is saying, or if we're increasing or losing it. The little trees that people put in place are not going to have the same canopy, but they have the potential of being the same canopy, over time. And I think that layer of analysis should be considered by the council at the same time as this.
So to respond to a couple of things. First of all, I think my takeaway from so far the review of the ordinance and also the tree canopy assessment is that there's a lot of room for outreach and education. I think, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have two comments. One is not to beat this dead horse with this little circle here, but I'm almost positive that was a microburst a couple years ago that took down a huge number of trees in that area along Sligo, and that would be one of the first data points related to more intense storms that we're experiencing. And my second point is to build on what Jim was talking about and the woman back here about planting either intentionally or unintentionally. Jim and I helped lead an initiative in the Long Branch Sligo neighborhood where we took money that we won from the Neighborhood Energy Challenge, and we planted a bunch of trees with that money in the neighborhood. And there was intense interest in planting trees. I mean, we didn't have enough trees for all the people that wanted to plant them. And so there is this good experience here in the town, in one of the more forested areas of the town, where people are enthusiastically planting trees, even in places where trees probably shouldn't be planted. We wanted to make sure that people were planting the trees if they had that desire to do so. And there was more demand than supply. So we have this experience here, and I think moving forward we could build on that.
I just also wanted to add that we do report annually on the number of tree permits, trees removed, tree planting, all that data. So and we have that historically for decades.
Again, thank you for the presentation. I was looking at the chart that you had with the green bars showing the number of trees and the heights. Is that a healthy distribution of heights? And what does that mean for the future of our tree canopy? Because it looks like you said the majority is probably between 50 and 80 feet. And it doesn't look like we have a lot of trees in the lower ranges coming up to replace those, or am I misinterpreting that?
That's a very good question. I That is not within my realm of expertise. The closest thing that I've actually seen to this is population dynamics for countries, and so I wonder if it's a similar concept. But yeah, I can't really comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's really good to look into that. I think, over the past couple of weeks, I've touched base with a number of counterparts with other jurisdictions, Bowie, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, DC. So I think in general, because of the canopy age, there's actually a loss, a reduction. And so, tree planting is going to be really important, but can you keep up, and how many trees need to be planted in order to, to make up for the loss? And I think the time frame is really important too, as has been mentioned, that how many of those smaller trees are actually large canopy trees and how many are small canopy trees. That's really hard to identify. The only way, so this is a bottom or top-down assessment, and then an inventory would be the bottom up, where you actually inventory, and then you can have a better sense of what kind of species and also canopy size.
And I assume that the 0 number is probably not showing a full representation, because you said the LiDAR only shows 8 feet and higher. So that number is probably a bigger number. Is that correct?
That's a very good question. I actually am not quite sure about what I think that would be the bin of, actually no, I am sure. That's the bin of 8 to 10 foot trees there. Because, so we're essentially saying, I think, I'm not actually sure how this graph does it, but it's possible that there are less than 8 foot trees not being included in this number here. That's definitely a possibility, and I would say probably likely that that is true.
In a past presentation, I heard tree canopy described as similar to ages. You've got the baby trees, the elementary, the teenagers, the middle age, and then the old folks. I'd say we'd have a lot to worry about if the majority of our trees were the old folks, because that means we have nothing coming up to replace them. I'm buoyed by what I see in the 10, 20, 30, 40 category. That means we've got elementary, middle school trees ready to go. Having that healthy band in the 60, 70, 80, that's our middle agers, maybe even a little into the 50s, 60s, particularly when a tree is 60 feet tall, they can tend to get 100, 120, 130 feet. So, usually you expect to see a bell curve. Our bell curve is a little weighted to show higher trees at a younger age, potentially, which to me is a positive thing, meaning that past replanting efforts are showing up in this kind of information. Now, it may be that those are all crepe myrtles, and so we can't definitely distinguish the difference there.
Thank you. Yeah, and related to that point, because it really is important to know, a lot of the replanting's been in city right-of-ways under power lines, so it's been little trees that'll never grow very tall. And so theoretically, a lot of those shorter ones are little trees that will never grow very tall. But my question is, I would love to be part, as a volunteer resident, of like a field study, and I wonder if the city council could consider that, and the tree commission, of really inviting residents, even before the replanting thing, to help us really all get together and do a field study. Is that possible?
Could you be a bit more specific about, as to the field study, what you mean exactly by that?
Well, if you would organize us and give us assignments about, blocks that you would tell us what you want us to measure and take pictures of and look for, but we try to organize the whole city, and maybe pay more attention to the wards, like I think it's Ward 6, where there really is a scarcity.
And Jan, I think that could be in the form of a field collector, again, being at the lat long point, saying, okay, here's a point we're putting down here to be used in GIS, and what maybe species identification, any other attributes. I've done similar work on field studies.
I'd just like to ask 2 questions. One is to Noah, what was the most surprising thing about this data, doing this data and comparing it to previous years for you? Was there a surprise in it for you?
That's a really good question. Oh man. I think I'm very impressed with the city of Takoma Park and all the work that's been done in terms of maintaining a healthy population. And it's really, I think probably the thing that's impressing me most is just during this conversation how much people care about dips in the health quality of tree canopy and all of I mean, it's inspiring to see that all the work that has been done and is going to be done in terms of maintaining a healthy tree population here. So thank you all for being here, really.
So I have one other part to the question, and that's maybe for this afternoon, but my experience is that a lot of times when I'm consulting with a client who has mature trees on their property, it's a question of they might like to plant something else. We have to work within the existing tree root system, the existing canopy that's there. So we're often looking for a place to plant a smaller tree, assuming that the large tree that's on the property is going to stay healthy. So that becomes a tricky question of how. So I see the intent as being really good. We're adding something to it by planting smaller trees, and often more for wildlife benefit than tree canopy volume. But that's also an interesting question of how it's a participation question, I think, and how do people buy into this value. So that's just an observation.
I think just, I don't think from my perspective there were many surprises from the report. I think it just reinforced a number of things. One being that the majority of the canopy is on private property, and how important, I think outreach, education are from that regards. Also that there's a loss is not an entire surprise, seeing the number of large canopy trees that are removed. And as I said, several other jurisdictions are experiencing something similar. So, those are two things that were not necessarily surprising to me, that kind of stood out. And then, that the effort with an implementation plan also needs to be on, private property owners, also the city right of way, the plantings there. So those two things. Any other questions? All right.
If we can't make this afternoon session, how can we continue to be involved?
Do you have the microphone?
Want me to review? Oh, okay. If we can't be here this afternoon, how can we hear the report out from that and then be involved in subsequent sessions?
So we'll make sure that there's minutes online, and then there will be future. I'll start working on a implementation plan based on a lot of the input here from the report, the assessment, and also the afternoon session. And then we'll go to the Tree Commission, the Committee of the Environment, and so forth. So, and then to the council eventually. So there's a whole process that we're kind of still working our way through. So there will definitely be an opportunity for people to engage and provide their input and so forth.
Yeah, and the Tree Commission has monthly meetings, and there's a joint subcommittee to deal with setting the tree canopy goal and associated activities. So I would encourage keeping an eye on the website so that if a meeting meets your comfort, you're more than welcome to come and engage that way too. And it's very likely there are going to be some public input features to this.
I could put together a list, and you can sign it. Anyone else here who can't make the afternoon session, and maybe we'll have an update. There's a small group who's part of the Tree Commission and part of the Committee on the Environment who's focusing on this, and we can have like a supplemental announcement list potentially for that.
The question I had related to the landscaping issue, Jan, I wondered if you could answer. My impression is that if you plant an oak tree, a little oak tree under a big oak tree, the little oak tree is going to kind of wait its turn, and it won't get huge until there's more light. And I mean, that trees kind of have a natural intelligence about, if you plant a big shade tree, yes, it can become very, very big, but it's likely to be a much slower grower than if it's, if it had full range itself. I don't know. So I'm just asking you, when people are thinking about replanting a shade tree when they already have shade trees, does that kind of help to mitigate that concern?
Well, I think it's quite common for people to replant a tree, as a replacement, knowing that the tree is at the end of their lifespan. But at the same time, I think it's important to do it when a tree is fairly close to its lifespan, because the phototropism. So a tree starts to grow towards the light. If the period is too long, then you get you see that quite a bit. That trees start to grow under angles that are not the most beneficial. And so I think it's a great idea to start planting. I don't know, Diane, you were talking about smaller canopy trees. This is in addition to the large canopy tree, or were you talking about replacement trees?
Thank you. This is based on a few examples. For the most part, people wanted to either have something more ornamental at a lower level that they could actually see, not only the trunk of a big tree, but that they wanted to do that. A lot of people want to add particularly native trees for wildlife benefit. So there's a range of reasons, and sometimes it's a challenge to satisfy that within an existing property. So that might also be a way to get some public participation if people that need or want trees perhaps can't afford them, belong to a pool where people could say, well, I'd really love to contribute to this. Let me contribute to this person who doesn't have a tree yet. I mean, that's just a thought. But the reasons that people want to plant ornamental trees are kind of more aesthetic or emotional, usually. So that's
and I think it's perfectly possible to plant smaller canopy trees. I think you just have to be mindful of the root system of the existing tree, particularly the root plate. Those are the roots that anchor the tree, that you kind of stay outside of that area, and then not plant too many in the critical root zone of the tree. But I think it works perfectly well to have smaller trees around larger canopy trees. So, but the right place principle is really critical, and it's just you take into consideration the existing vegetation, utilities, et cetera, with planting. So that's really a key point.
2 questions. Do you have any longitudinal data on this chart, tracking over the years what that shape is staying steady or shifting? That might even reveal if Daryl's inclination is correct, that our adolescent trees are growing in number. And the second thing is, can you get into, beyond some of the conclusions you had at the end of the slide, what are some of possible implementation steps that we're going to talk more about this afternoon, especially for people who aren't going to be here?
Okay, the first question. What we have currently here and what we've prepared today to present are just the 2018 number of trees and height of trees. However, we definitely have the data for 2014 and 2019. I'm not sure if the tree it's very likely that the tree canopy height has already been calculated from those. If those have not already been calculated, they can be calculated, and they can be looked at longitudinally from 2009, 2014, 2018.
So I'm looking at what was that?
He had a second question.
Go ahead.
And the second question was about what are some possible implementation steps on improving and changing, expanding
The tree canopy? Yeah. I think, as I mentioned previously, education and outreach, I think, are really important, and to, get people more involved. I think based on the information that, has come out of the assessment and the report and the presentation, is, we can look at, property ownership and to how to target particular property owners, and then also within a certain land use. So you have, let's say, for example, commercial properties. Is there, a room to increase the canopy? And, is there then maybe a possibility to work with economic development to do outreach to commercial property owners? I'm just giving one example, and there's multiple. But in that way, to target a particular group of owners, property owners, to see if we, can help with education and also promote tree planting on the commercial properties. That's one example. So, I think we'll discuss it more this afternoon. There will be minutes taken, but there's a lot of different other things, and then the same thing, could be done for private property owners. School systems, institutions that are in the city of Takoma Park. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. We'll meet again at 1 o'clock in the Azalea room. We have it all set up there. So hopefully you can make it this afternoon.